Start the second session with the overview of the sponsorship system of Qatar, which I know you are most familiar with. It's called the Kafala system. And later on, I will also discuss about the changes, the enacted changes and proposed changes in the employment and sponsorship system. So let's start off with the sponsorship law. So the general rule is that any foreigner who wants to reside in Qatar should have a valid permit from the relevant authority, and this necessarily means that the foreigner should have a valid sponsorship. So one of the most common basis for sponsorship is the employment sponsorship, which is on the basis of your employer-employee relationship with your employer. So it means that anyone who works in the state of Qatar should have or should be under the sponsorship of your employer. Okay, hand in hand with the sponsorship system is what we call the exit permit system. So any foreign resident cannot go out of the country without a valid permission from his sponsor. This is the general rule. So the foreign residents can avail of either a single exit permit, which means that every time that you want to go out of the country, you have to get the permission of your sponsor, so you will be given an exit permit and be able to travel. But another option would be a multiple exit permit, where you will request your sponsor to avail this system for you so that within a year, you can go out of the country for an unlimited period of time without going back to your sponsor every time that you want to go out of the country. So what happens if, in rarest instances, your sponsor refuses to give you an exit permit? In these cases, it doesn't mean that you will not be able to go out of the country. The law provides options and protections in your favor. So one option would be you will go to the Ministry of Interior and you will apply for an exit sponsor. You will explain to the Ministry of Interior the situation that either your sponsor is refusing your exit permit, or he is not available to give you an exit permit, and in which case an exit sponsor will be appointed for you. The exit sponsor, the purpose is for you to have someone who can guarantee that either you will come back, or you don't have outstanding commitments or loans or court cases. In which case, the Ministry of Interior will allow you to have an exit permit based on the exit sponsor. Another thing that you can do is for you to publish your personal details and the date of your intended departure from the country, and then these details will be published once in 2 daily newspapers, in which case it has to be published once, and then you should wait for 15 days to lapse. After 15 days, you can go to the relevant labor courts, competent courts, and then let them know that the publication has been done, and then the court, once he is satisfied that you have complied with all the requirements and procedures, they will issue a certificate clearance. This will serve as a substitute for your exit permit, so you will be allowed to go out of the country. The next issue would be if you want to transfer your sponsorship from your old sponsor to another one. This is allowed, provided that you get a no objection certificate from your old sponsor. Another requirement would be you should be able to stay with your old sponsor for a minimum period of 1 year. Then, once he has no objection for you to transfer, then this is allowed. Another important rule that we should take into consideration is that an employee who is under the sponsorship of his employer cannot work for other companies, or an employer cannot hire foreign employees who are already under the sponsorship of another. The exception would be the secondment arrangement, in which case, if your sponsor allows you to be employed by another company under a secondment arrangement, The Ministry of Interior will allow this for a period of 6 months, and which is renewable for another period of 6 months. This will also apply in instances when your employer is allowing you to work for others outside of your official working times, and then the Ministry of Interior will also recognize the permission of your old sponsor so as to allow you to work for another company for a period of 6 months as well, and renewable for the same period. If, for example, your contract has already expired, or your work has already been terminated, or the term of your contract has already been finished, and you want to transfer to another employer, you have to get an NOC. And if the NOC is not provided to you, then you will have to go back to your home country, and there is a limitation of 2 years for you to come back to the state of Qatar for purposes of work. In instances that your sponsor, for example, has committed a crime, or your sponsor is not complying with the terms and conditions of the executed contract, or if you are not receiving your salary, it doesn't mean that in these cases, and the employer is not giving you an NOC, that you cannot be transferred. The law provides options for you that you can avail of. One is that first, you will file a labor case before the competent courts about the non-compliance with the contracts or the commission of the crime, and in which case you will go to the Ministry of Interior and let them know that there is a pending lawsuit. In this instance, the Ministry of Interior will transfer your sponsorship from your current sponsor to another one. And aside from that, there are other recourses that you can avail of. You can file a complaint before the Human Rights Department in the Ministry of Interior, and also file a complaint before the National Human Rights Committee. These two committees, once you have filed a complaint with them, will necessarily coordinate with the Ministry of Interior to review the case, and if they found grounds, then they will allow you or give you a permission to be able to transfer your sponsorship to another one. Earlier, we have spoken about the employment sponsorship. Now we will go to the personal sponsorship. One of the most common types of personal sponsorship is what we call spousal sponsorship, or commonly termed as husband sponsor. There are several scenarios that we can think of under the personal sponsorship or spousal sponsorship. First is if the husband comes in first to the state of Qatar, and then he wants to get his wife and kids to be with him to stay in the state. So this is allowed. So the husband will apply for a husband sponsor to allow him to get his wife and children to be with him in the state of Qatar. So he will just apply, fill up the ministry form, attach his bank statements, the lease agreement for where he resides, and as long as his salary is within the bracket that has been assigned by the Ministry of Interior, then you will be allowed to sponsor your wife and kids. Now, what if the wife gets a job later? In this case, even if the wife gets a job later, the law specifically states that the wife should not be able to transfer to the sponsorship of her new employer. She should stay with the sponsorship of her husband. This is to protect the family so that they will not be under several sponsorships, and then the husband will retain sponsorship over his wife and kids. The second scenario would be if the wife is the one who first came into the state, in which case the law also allows the wife to sponsor the husband and the kids. In this case, if the husband gets a job later on, he is allowed to transfer his sponsorship to the new employer. And furthermore, he can get his wife to be under his own sponsorship. The third scenario would be if a man and a woman, they are under separate employers, And then later on, they get married. The man, of course, can get his wife, and the kids would be under his sponsorship. A question came up before if there is an obligation for the woman to transfer under the sponsorship of the husband. This is not obliged, but merely optional. So it is within the decision of the couple if the husband would want to get his wife under his sponsorship, or for the woman to be retained under her own employer's sponsorship. Another form of personal sponsorship is what we call domestic and family sponsorship. One question would be, can a foreign employee sponsor a domestic workers? And yes, you can, as long as you are married, because the sponsorship for domestic workers, they are reserved for family. So a married couple can sponsor a domestic worker. Another point would be if the public employees, because one obligation for a sponsor is in case of death of the domestic worker. One obligation would be for you to repatriate the remains of the domestic worker back to the home country. And you have to pay for the expenses for this repatriation. But if you don't pay for the expenses to get back the remains of the domestic worker back home, then the authority would deduct the salary. Sponsoring immediate family is also allowed under the laws and the procedures of the Ministry of Interior. So a foreign resident can also invite, like for example, a parent or a siblings to be with you in the state of Qatar. However, the period would be shorter than for a wife or a husband, in which case you have to apply for a family visit visa, which the Ministry of Interior will approve initially for 1 month, and then after you can renew it for another period of 6 months. After 6 months, it will be discretionary upon the Ministry of Interior whether to give further extension or otherwise. Then when your family goes out of Qatar, the procedure before is you have to wait for 3 months for you to get back your family to Qatar. So she has to be out of the country for 3 months. For example, your parent, she has to be out of the country for 3 months before she comes back. But right now, the recent instructions of the Ministry of Interior is that these 3 months is not being implemented. So even for a shorter period of time, your immediate family can go back under a family visit visa. Another important thing that we should consider under the sponsorship law is the liabilities of the sponsor. Would the sponsor be liable for his employee's personal loan? The general rule is that the sponsor will be liable if he is duly notified of the commitment of the employee, and he has approved in writing the undertaking of such commitment. So, as you may know, when you are applying for bank loans, you will have to submit a salary certificate, and usually the employer will state a reservation, a one-liner reservation, saying that this is being undertaken by the employee himself and we will not be liable for that. In which case, the employer will not be liable for your commitments because he is expressly reserving his right not to be liable for the debts and loans that you are undertaking. However, if the employer did not reserve such right and he is duly notified and he approved the commitment that the sponsored employee is undertaking, then he will be liable as well. But his liability is not direct. The creditor should first exhaust all the monies and properties of the sponsored employee before he can go to the employer and ask for the debt to be paid. Another liability of the sponsor is liability towards any fees associated with expatriation. So whenever the contract of the employee has already been finished, or you were terminated, or you have resigned, your sponsor is liable for your expenses to be able to go back to your home country. The last liability that the law specifically provides is with regard to funeral and burial expenses. In case of death of the sponsored employee, the sponsor has the liability to pay for your expenses for your burial in the state of Qatar. However, in case your family, of course, would apply for the expatriation of your remains back to your home country, then the sponsor should also pay for these expenses. So all the things that I have spoken about can be summarized into this. We have to remember that the sponsorship for work shall be borne by the employer. The head of the family shall be the sponsor of his family members. The residing host, like for example, if you invite your parents or your siblings, you will be the sponsor of your visiting guest. And the husband retains sponsorship of his wife and children, even if the wife secures a job later. The wife who comes to Qatar for work can sponsor her husband and kids. And lastly, if a Qatari woman is married to a foreigner, the Qatari woman has also the right to provide sponsorship to her husband and children. Now we will go to the labor law updates. As you may know, recently there is an amendment that has been made to the labor law. It's law number 1 of 2015 regarding the mandatory requirement of companies to pay employees through direct bank transfers. So now, regardless of the amount of your salary, the employer or the sponsor they are required now to provide bank accounts where your salary should be given. This is to provide more transparency for the authorities to monitor the delayed salary payments. As of now, the Qatar Central Bank is formulating policies to ensure that this new amendment will be orderly enforced. As to the sponsorship law, as you may know, the state of Qatar has undertaken commitments to change the kafala system. But as of now, there are no confirmed changes, but there are proposed changes that are being discussed and debated on by the Shura Council. And as far as we are aware, some of these changes would be about the exit permit. So what is being proposed is, instead of the sponsor giving the discretion to grant exit permit, it will be given now to the authorities, provided that you inform the Ministry of Interior of your intent to depart the country within 3 days. And then another one would be change in the NOC system. So under the proposal, what will happen is, it will not be based on sponsorship system, but rather on your contract. So if your contract states a fixed period, after the end of the period, you can transfer to another employer or to another sponsor without the need of NOC. And if your contract is with indefinite period, what is being proposed is you must have a minimum of 5 years. You must be working with your sponsor for a minimum of 5 years, and after which you can transfer sponsorship to another without the requirement of NOC. So that concludes my presentation.